In late April 1961, President John F. Kennedy, in a private moment with his special counsel Theodore Sorensen, asked a question that he would repeat to himself over and over in the following weeks. Kennedy wondered aloud, how could I have been so stupid as to let them proceed? He was referring to the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, which had just humiliated itself, the new president, and the nation by completely bungling its secret invasion of Cuba. Known as Operation Zapata, the mission was intended to overthrow Fidel Castro and was to appear to be the work of Cuban exiles. There was to be no trace of U.S. government involvement. The disaster came to be known as the Bay of Pigs, which historian Theodore Draper would later call the perfect failure. This was an especially bitter pill to swallow for a president who believed in the effectiveness of this type of operation.
Kennedy certainly had a fascination with the world of spies and special agents. James Bond was part of his favorite reading, and he liked to find ways by which the United States could engage in international affairs, a minimum risk to the United States, and this seemed to him to be a natural way. Also, I think there was a deeper reason for his interest, which was a view that the next stage of the Cold War, the coming stage, involved the Third World, and that required a different sort of warfare. That what you had to think about was guerrillas, counterinsurgency, and this required a much more subtle blend of politics and direct action.
While the president publicly accepted the blame for the debacle, he privately threatened that heads would roll at the CIA. Just 3 months into his presidency, Kennedy had suffered a monumental embarrassment. The relationship between the president and the CIA would never be the same. The director of the CIA under Kennedy was veteran spy master Allen Dulles, a key member of the Eisenhower administration. Dulles and his director of plans, Richard Bissell, were highly regarded in Washington. It was widely believed that Bissell would be the next in line to head the CIA. Kennedy and his cabinet, including Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, were very impressed with Bissell.
Dick Bissell was an extraordinarily bright, able man, former professor from Yale University. It was he, more than any other single person, who built the overhead reconnaissance capability of the country. First, through the U-2, it was a major source of intelligence for our nation under Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson, to some degree even today.
But Bissell had been the man directly in charge of the Bay of Pigs plan. Such a calamity tarnished his golden boy image beyond repair. Kennedy removed both Dulles and Bissell from office, cutting short the careers of one intelligence legend and another legend in the making. The Bay of Pigs was not born of the Kennedy administration. In March 1960, President Dwight Eisenhower approved a CIA plan entitled A Program of Covert Action Against the Castro Regime. This 10-page document outlined the plan to, in its words, bring about the replacement of the Castro regime with one more devoted to the true interests of the Cuban people and more acceptable to the U.S. Ike demanded total secrecy for the operation. The initial plan called for a small force of 300 CIA-trained Cuban exiles to be landed on a Cuban beach. They would then link up with what CIA intelligence reports confirmed were pockets of many thousands of anti-Castro Cubans. The CIA force was to organize these pockets into an army that would take Havana and remove Fidel Castro. Kennedy inherited the Cuba project in January 1961 and was never enthusiastic about it. By mid-March 1961, after considering the many pitfalls of the plan, Kennedy called Allen Dulles to discuss canceling the operation. Dulles convinced the president that it was too late to pull the plug for two reasons. One was the impression Kennedy would give if he, a minor naval officer in World War II, were to challenge the wisdom of Eisenhower, the former Supreme Allied commander during that war. Then there was the problem of dealing with the exile force.
Dulles said, how are you going to dispose of these Cuban exiles if you don't let them land at the Bay of Pigs? If we let these people loose in the United States, it was said that they would create a political problem.
The Cuba project was already an irreversible mess. Part of the problem was a lack of checks and balances within the operation. From the start, Bissell had maneuvered for complete control of Operation Zapata.
Bissell counted on his close, very quick affinity with Kennedy to essentially withhold information from people around him in the Bay of Pigs operation, figuring he had the personal ear of the president and he could get Kennedy to do what he wanted to do.
Even secrecy and plausible deniability were no longer on the side of the U.S. In early April, the CIA intercepted a communique from the Soviet embassy in Mexico City to Moscow, giving the exact date of the intended invasion, April 17th. A few days later, the New York Times ran a story entitled "Anti-Castro Units Trained to Fight at Florida Bases." It was suspected that the press gained its information from loose-lipped members of the Cuban exile community in the U.S. Some historians believe that Richard Bissell never imagined such a defeat because Fidel Castro himself was to have been removed from the equation. Bissell's plan included the assassination of Castro, which Bissell expected to be carried out prior to the actual invasion. The job was given to members of the U.S. Mafia who had been raking in profits from Havana nightclubs and casinos, which Castro seized along with all other American holdings in 1960. But by April 10th, the mob hadn't killed Castro. Bissell had to go through with the invasion with Castro still in power. The problems didn't end there. The initial landing site near Trinidad was vetoed by President Kennedy at the suggestion of Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Rusk felt that a surprise invasion was not possible there due to the dense population. Kennedy gave Bissell just 4 days to come up with another plan. The new site was at Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. The area was remote and there was a nearby airfield. But the new politically acceptable landing area could not satisfy the operation's main military objective, quickly linking up with the largest concentration of rebels who were hiding in the Escambray Mountains. Access to those mountains was cut off by a vast swamp. Marine Colonel Jack Hawkins, attached to the CIA as chief paramilitary specialist in charge of the invasion, explained the new landing area's shortcomings to Bissell.
I said, we can land there, and we can hold on there for a little while, but not for long. And the troops can't get out of there to get over to the mountains where they need to be. And he said at that time, well, if that is the only place that can satisfy the president's requirements, that's where we have to go.
Kennedy approved the plan, but Jack Hawkins and his immediate superior, Jacob Esterline, knew that it could not succeed. The brigade could not reach the mountains, and without air support, critical supply drops could not be made, and the men on the beach would be picked off by Castro's Air Force. Hawkins and Esterline confronted Bissell and announced they were resigning their posts, but Bissell managed to change their minds.
He said, I depend on you, and here I am. You can't leave me alone about this. He says, we'll do the best we can. I'll try to get more air for you, he says. I think maybe I can get the president to get more air.
A plan to improve the operation's chance of success was approved at the last minute by the president. On April 15th, 2 days before the invasion, 8 American B-26 bombers, painted with Cuban Air Force colors and insignias and piloted by Cuban exiled pilots, flew a bombing mission to destroy the Cuban Air Force. To complete the deception, one plane landed in Key West and the pilot asked for political asylum in the U.S. He claimed Castro's Air Force had been severely crippled. When the Cuban ambassador to the United Nations accused the U.S. of masterminding the attack, American Ambassador Adlai Stevenson emphatically denied the charges.
And I deny them categorically.
But the veil over the plot was transparent, and Stevenson, who was purposely misled by the CIA about U.S. involvement in the attack, was livid when he found out the truth. To save himself any more embarrassment, he insisted that President Kennedy cancel any further air raids on Cuba. Kennedy decided to go forward with the operation, but canceled the second air raid. That decision had dire consequences. By April 1961, the cost of Operation Zapata, the CIA's secret invasion of Cuba, had ballooned from the original $4.4 million to an astounding $48 million. The invasion force had also grown from just over 300 to over 1,400. The CIA's Deputy Director of Plans, Richard Bissell, claimed that there was significant internal support in Cuba to overthrow Castro. He insisted that Brigade 2506 would be welcomed and joined by thousands who would march on Havana. President Kennedy had no reason to doubt him, but Bissell's sources regarding internal support were dubious.
The CIA intelligence was overly optimistic and was to a great extent collected from Cuban refugees in Miami who had left Cuba. And of course their natural inclination would be to report things that would be supportive to their own agenda.
In the pre-dawn hours of April 17, 1961, Brigade 2506 began its assault at the Bay of Pigs. Only the Cuban military was there to meet them. Against this Cuban force, with its superior firepower and surprising devotion to Castro, the exile army never had a chance. The brigade was pushed back to the sea, soundly defeated in less than 72 hours. Instead of depriving the Soviet Union of an ally in the Western Hemisphere, the United States actually helped to solidify Havana's relationship with Moscow. Just the day before, at the Cuban state funeral for those killed in the April 15th air raid, Castro defiantly declared that Cuba was now a Marxist-Leninist state. Jack Hawkins holds 3 men most responsible for the failure at the Bay of Pigs: Kennedy and Secretary of State Rusk for canceling the critical second air raid, and Richard Bissell for not telling the president of Hawkins and Esterline's belief that Operation Zapata could not succeed.
We were the professionals, actually, not Mr. Bissell. He later finally said, long afterward, I should have listened to Hawkins and Esterline, but he never reported to anybody in any of his writings that I know of the fact of our urgent Sunday meeting where we told him we've got to stop this thing right now. He never did report that.
Allen Dulles was replaced with conservative Republican John McCone, who was immediately instructed by the president to curtail all CIA activity. To avenge his brother's embarrassment, Robert Kennedy took personal command of Operation Mongoose, an interagency task force bent on eliminating Fidel Castro. As the project's operations chief, the Kennedys chose a swaggering Air Force officer with a towering reputation in the Third World. He was Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, and the president liked what he saw.
I think what really probably appealed to him was the reputation of a man who understood the Third World, who could open important contacts with Third World leaders. He had stood at the right hand of Philippine President Magsaysay in defeating an insurgency, and that was the kind of man Kennedy wanted.
The president, although still upset about the Bay of Pigs fiasco, realized that the CIA, under Lansdale's authority, could make valuable contributions to Operation Mongoose. Lansdale was placed in the Defense Department and was given authority to call on senior representatives from state, defense, and the CIA for assistance. Economic sabotage was part of Operation Mongoose. But the best-known features of the operation were its most outrageous schemes. One plan to kill Castro involved the use of poisonous cigars. A non-lethal alternative was to put chemicals in the wetsuit he used for scuba diving that would cause his famous beard to fall out, thus diminishing his charisma. Lansdale was brilliant at self-promotion, but he did not live up to his image. Operation Mongoose was a miserable failure. Access to Castro was nearly impossible. Even when opportunities arose, bad luck would intervene.
Castro every day would go for a milkshake. We found out about this, and we gave the soda jerk a poison pill to put in Castro's milkshake. He was working for us. He put the pill in the freezer behind the ice cream, and when it came time for him to put the pill in Castro's milkshake, the pill had stuck to the side of the freezer, and he couldn't get it loose.
Eventually, Lansdale was removed as chief of Operation Mongoose. Attempts to kill Castro continued for the duration of the Kennedy administration, but American operatives could never penetrate the dictator's loyal inner circle. On the other side of the world, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity to take advantage of the apparently weak young American president. But what Khrushchev didn't know was that one of his own spies was about to tip the Cold War balance in favor of the United States. The CIA remained in President Kennedy's doghouse as a result of the Bay of Pigs. But Kennedy was not one to depend solely on the heads of large government agencies for critical intelligence information and counsel.
Kennedy was famous for, in the middle of the night, calling desk officers in the State Department so he could get his first-hand information about what was going on, because he believed that the information they would send to their superiors and went up through the chain of command in the State Department would get garbled.
Kennedy did, however, build an inner circle consisting of some of the brightest men of the era. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Special Counsel Theodore Sorensen, Special Assistant Arthur Schlesinger, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, Head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Maxwell Taylor, and Attorney General Bobby Kennedy were his core advisors. The opinions of these men were of great value to the president. But JFK made up his own mind on how to ultimately handle any situation, usually depending on his gut feelings. When it came to processing information and making decisions, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was much like Kennedy.
I think he was his own foreign minister the same way the President Kennedy was his own Secretary of State. Because the strong leader, he wanted just to perform his foreign policy and to present his understanding.
The two most powerful men in the world met face to face for the first and only time at a summit in Vienna in June of 1961. Kennedy hoped to achieve a nuclear test ban treaty with Khrushchev and to develop a positive working relationship with the Soviet leader. Khrushchev, however, was in a hostile mood as a result of the Bay of Pigs just 2 months earlier. The discussion quickly shifted to the divided city of Berlin. What the Soviets really wanted was to eliminate an outpost for Western ideals in the midst of East Germany because it was providing an escape route to the West for thousands of their most skilled professionals. Kennedy was committed to protecting West Berlin. Khrushchev declared to Kennedy, "I want peace, but if you want war, that is your problem." JFK stood his ground on West Berlin, saying, "Well, if that's true, it's going to be a cold winter." The Berlin crisis dominated Kennedy's summer. When the Soviets began construction of the Berlin Wall on August 19th, U.S. intelligence was caught off guard. Kennedy's advisors first thought that the wall might have its benefits.
The initial reaction was that, well, maybe this has diffused the crisis. The second reaction, however, was that maybe all that Khrushchev is doing is stabilizing his own situation in order to make the next move, which will be on West Berlin itself.
The two sides nearly went to war as American and Soviet tanks converged on Checkpoint Charlie and stared each other down for 16 hours. Kennedy stood fast against the Soviet threat, armed with secret knowledge of the way the Kremlin was playing this game of chicken. That information was supplied by one of the most influential Soviet spies of the Cold War era, Colonel Oleg Penkovsky. He was the deputy head of the foreign section of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. In 1960, after having become disillusioned with the Soviet system, Penkovsky offered his services to both Great Britain's MI6 and to the CIA. From 1960 to 1962, Penkovsky provided the West with hundreds of pages of secretly photographed, classified Soviet documents. For his valuable service, Penkovsky asked to be granted either American or British citizenship. The dream of this Red Army colonel was to become a colonel in the U.S. Army. He was thrilled when CIA friends took these photos of him in the uniforms of an American Army colonel and a British Army colonel. Penkovsky's value as a spy was immeasurable because he had regular access to the top men in the Kremlin. He knew how the minds of these men worked, including that of Nikita Khrushchev. At the height of the Berlin crisis, Penkovsky strongly counseled that President Kennedy remain firm and not show Khrushchev the slightest hint of hesitance to defend West Berlin. That was, according to Penkovsky, the only thing that Khrushchev would respect. It worked. Kennedy's unwavering resolve caused Khrushchev to capitulate. Quietly, the Russian tanks pulled back from the borderline and the Americans followed suit. Penkovsky's advice was key in diffusing the Berlin crisis. Kennedy learned an invaluable lesson in dealing with Khrushchev. Such posturing would serve him well as the focus of the Cold War shifted back to the island nation of Cuba. In the fall of 1962, a situation was brewing in Cuba that would again force a showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union. Beginning in late 1960 and extending through 1961, the National Security Agency was intercepting messages concerning Soviet ships headed for Havana. These radio messages revealed that two ships had indeed delivered military equipment to Cuba. By late August 1962, the NSA had determined that there had been 57 shipments in little more than a one-month period. Then the CIA made a discovery that deeply concerned Director John McCone. On August 28th, U-2 spy plane photos showed that there were surface-to-air missiles in Cuba.
We saw them being placed all around Cuba, and the only person in Washington, D.C. who thought that that meant some trouble in the future was John McCone. He kept saying over and over again, you don't put SAM sites, you don't put air defense items in unless you're going to defend something. And the only thing you're going to defend is going to be big missiles when they come in later. Nobody in Washington wanted to believe him, but he kept insisting.
President Kennedy did not feel that McCone had determined anything of value and did not act. Then, on October 14th, photos from the U-2 flight over Cuba revealed a shocking discovery: evidence of a medium-range ballistic missile site. 8 large missile transporters and 4 Erector launchers were determined to be in a tentative firing position. The discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in the Western Hemisphere pointed at American cities created the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. The U.S. had Jupiter missiles in Italy and Turkey pointed at the USSR, and the Soviets had targeted many Western European assets. But for America, missiles just 90 miles away was a new and terrifying experience. Subsequent U-2 missions revealed more medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles in Cuba. On October 16th, the president hand-picked 19 men and formed ExComm, an executive committee of the National Security Council to deal with the crisis. Believing this was a buildup of offensive weapons, ExComm met around the clock for the next 13 days to discuss possible diplomatic and military courses of action. Secretary of Defense McNamara felt that the missiles gave the USSR no more destructive power against the U.S. than it already held. Secretary of State Rusk was concerned that, as in Berlin, some action was needed so as not to undermine U.S. alliances worldwide. The Joint Chiefs argued strongly for an airstrike to take out all the missiles before they could be fired. At this crucial moment in Cold War history, Kennedy turned not to his military but to his civilian advisors. One of those closest to JFK and a member of ExComm was Arthur Schlesinger.
He knew that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were a bunch of idiots, in a sense, and disregarded their recommendations. Had he followed their recommendations at the time of the missile crisis, we would have invaded Cuba, and we now know that the Soviet troops in Cuba, there were 40,000 of them, not the 8 or 10,000 estimated by the CIA at the time. We now know that they were armed with not only long-range nuclear missiles, but tactical nuclear missiles with instructions to use them in case of an American invasion.
For the moment, JFK's choice of a diplomatic rather than a military solution may well have saved the world from nuclear holocaust. At this juncture, Kennedy could not afford to let Moscow know that he knew that the missiles existed. As days passed, more U-2 photos revealed many other missile sites. On October 21st, Maxwell Taylor finally admitted to the president that he could not guarantee that his bombers could destroy all of the missiles in Cuba. ExComm would have had no idea how close the missiles were to being launch-ready were it not for one of the most important pieces of intelligence of the Cold War provided by Colonel Oleg Penkovsky. Penkovsky had furnished the CIA with a complete Soviet field manual for short and medium-range missiles. With that manual, the U.S. could determine from U-2 photos when the missiles would be ready to fire. This critical information bought Kennedy a precious few additional days to perfect his strategy. On October 22nd, with his plan in place, Kennedy addressed the nation on television and revealed the missiles in Cuba to a shocked world.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
He also placed a quarantine upon Cuba, a naval blockade to be enforced by the U.S. Navy. Earlier that very day, Oleg Penkovsky was arrested in the USSR as a spy. He was tried and later executed. Over the next 5 days, the threat of nuclear holocaust hung over the planet. Terrified Americans prepared for the worst while John and Robert Kennedy pursued a peaceful resolution. President Kennedy had little faith in the State Department, and after losing faith in the CIA, he developed a private line of communication with Khrushchev, and it was time again to use it.
Kennedy, after the original Checkpoint Charlie clash, had a back channel of his own. He would write letters to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev would write him letters back. It was called the pen-pal correspondence, and they would talk to each other about these various issues. They didn't resolve very much in these letters, but it was thought useful to talk to each other.
Khrushchev was aware that the U.S. clearly had missile superiority over the Soviet Union. He had no delusions of his country surviving a nuclear attack. But it was not until years later that the world learned that both leaders truly wanted to avoid war.
Both Kennedy and Khrushchev would have survived a nuclear war. They both had places in secure mountainsides. They were not afraid of their own lives. They were afraid of the consequences of their decisions.
On October 26th, Kennedy received a ray of hope in a letter transmitted from Khrushchev offering to remove the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. The following day, the 27th, a second letter arrived from Khrushchev, which baffled Kennedy.
The letter which arrived in Washington second was actually written first. It's a tougher letter with more demands, asking for the missiles to be removed from Turkey. And the story is that on the 25th of October, a TASS reporter, who was really a KGB agent, overhears a conversation between two American reporters, one saying to the other, "I'm flying down to Florida later today so that I can be with the invading forces who are going into Cuba tomorrow." And the TASS reporter comes back and reports this to the Soviet embassy. Quickly, they report this to Moscow. Moscow, in an effort to stop the invasion, sends out a more conciliatory letter to Kennedy, hoping that a more conciliatory letter will stop the invasion.
The Soviet deputy ambassador then started to think that perhaps the Soviet news agency reporter had been a target for disinformation intended to fool the Soviets. He phoned the American journalist who was supposed to be on his way to Florida for the invasion and invited him to lunch the next day. The journalist accepted the invitation, and the deputy ambassador knew that the TASS reporter had been duped. The embassy rushed word of the false invasion plan to Moscow. As a result, Khrushchev immediately sent the first, more demanding letter which he'd written to Kennedy, not realizing the confusion that the two conflicting letters would cause in Washington. Kennedy decided to respond to Khrushchev based only on Khrushchev's first, less confrontational letter, as if the second letter had never reached the White House. Kennedy offered his promise not to invade Cuba if the missiles were promptly removed. If not, there would be military action against Cuba. Additionally, John and Robert Kennedy, without mentioning it to the rest of ExComm, included an offer to remove the U.S. missiles from Turkey at a later date. Then, in Moscow, Soviet intelligence received word from their agents in Washington that President Kennedy was to again address the American people on television on October 28th. Khrushchev was convinced this meant that the U.S. was going to invade Cuba. In Moscow at 9 a.m. Washington time on October 28th, in an effort to prevent nuclear war with the United States, Khrushchev announced the removal of the missiles from Cuba. Afterward, it was discovered that the Kremlin had misunderstood the American television schedule. There was no new speech by Kennedy.
And then it became clear that this spy in Washington, D.C. did not read the TV program in the right way, because they announced that we will repeat the Monday's presidential speech at 5 o'clock in the evening on next Sunday. So you see, it was the TV that just solved this crisis.
The Soviets loaded their missiles onto ships and returned them to the USSR. In addition to the direct and level-headed communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev, Soviet intelligence's confusion over the American television broadcast schedule helped resolve the most terrifying international showdown in history. By 1963, with Berlin and Cuba now temporarily defused, President Kennedy could deal with other hotspots, one of which he didn't consider too important, even though it would ultimately dominate U.S. foreign policy into the next decade.
Southeast Asia was not an area where Kennedy thought great things could be accomplished. He repeatedly made it clear that he did not want to get into a war there. He did perceive a problem, he did perceive a threat, he did spend some time on it, but he spent far more time on other issues than he did on Southeast Asia.
In 1954, U.S.-backed Ngo Dinh Diem was installed as Prime Minister of South Vietnam. Diem assured the Eisenhower administration that he favored democracy and would fight North Vietnamese insurgents to keep South Vietnam free from communism. But once entrenched as president of South Vietnam, Diem became a cruel dictator. He banned any future elections and utilized his special police headed by his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, to control any opposition through terror and imprisonment. By the end of the Eisenhower administration, there had been several coup attempts by Diem's own military. One of the biggest weaknesses of Diem's regime was that he did not have a solid relationship of trust with his generals.
I would doubt that a month went by in the whole of the Diem regime without some discussion of a possibility of a coup.
As a senator, John Kennedy had traveled to Vietnam and was impressed with Diem. But by the time Kennedy became president, Diem was no longer seen in the same glowing light.
Kennedy believes, in a sense, that we can't fight the war for them. We can help them learn how to fight the war. That's where special warfare and counterinsurgency come in. Send Green Berets, send advisors to help them do that. Now, what Kennedy does do is he escalates the number of advisors and the financial assistance. When he came in, there were about 500 or 1,000 advisors, maybe a little bit more. By the fall of 1963, there were over 16,000.
As always, Kennedy did not want to involve American soldiers in combat. In early 1961, prior to the Bay of Pigs, JFK urged the CIA to begin subversive operations in North Vietnam to send a message that the U.S. would no longer put up with the North's insurgency in the South. But the CIA operation, codenamed Operation Tiger, failed at every turn as a result of infiltration by North Vietnamese agents. Because of the CIA's failure, Kennedy turned over the covert war in Vietnam to the military in 1963. The growing U.S. military investment in Vietnam was kept secret from the world, in part because it violated the 1954 Geneva Agreement, calling for the cessation of hostilities in Vietnam. Another reason was to deceive the American public.
And that creates, for some people and for some analysts and some politicians, a problem, because they believe that what you do should be out in the sunlight. But the real world is a world in which even democracies have to sometimes do things secretly.
As the war dragged on, life in South Vietnam under President Diem was steadily worsening, and Kennedy could no longer ignore it. He and Diem were both Roman Catholic, but Kennedy found Diem's increasing persecution of Buddhists and other non-Catholics to be a serious problem. There was division in Washington on how to deal with Diem. In August 1963, an American-backed coup was considered and received great support from Henry Cabot Lodge, JFK's new ambassador to South Vietnam. Diem's generals had approached Lodge about possible U.S. support of a coup against the dictator. However, the generals were not quite ready to make their move on Diem. Then, in October, word reached President Kennedy that the plot against Diem was about to be carried out. The mood at the White House was somber and the opinions mixed. Robert Kennedy felt an obligation to Diem as an American ally. He, McNamara, and Maxwell Taylor all resisted the idea of a coup. Dean Rusk supported the overthrow, citing evidence showing that Diem, despite warnings from high-ranking American advisors, arrogantly resisted any change. Above all, JFK did not want another Bay of Pigs. He carefully considered all the information and opinions. His decision was to support the overthrow of Diem. On November 1st, 1963, the South Vietnamese army successfully deposed President Diem and his brother Nhu, and then executed them.
Maxwell Taylor reported that Kennedy was deeply shocked by the news that Diem had been assassinated. In the last week of August in 1963, Kennedy said flatly that if Diem and Nhu were overthrown, they should be exiled, and that was all that was supposed to happen to them.
Kennedy agonized, feeling a sense of responsibility for what had happened to Diem. Just 3 weeks later, in Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy himself was cut down by gunfire. Had he lived, he probably never could have imagined that the U.S. would still be embroiled in Vietnam more than a decade later. John Fitzgerald Kennedy served as president during possibly the most volatile period in the history of the United States. To counter the constant danger, Kennedy had always shown his willingness to pursue unconventional avenues.
Kennedy liked to have as many options as possible. He wanted to have a multifaceted capability, from covert action to special forces, ultimately to nuclear missiles. And in fact, Kennedy did strengthen all of those components of our arsenal.
Kennedy's reliance on intelligence and secret operations led to both painful defeats and remarkable victories. But perhaps his most important triumph was a battle that was never fought, a war with the Soviet Union.